and locked an entire nation behind the dreaded Iron Curtain. He did it by turning Russia into a tightly controlled police state and made his capital into a virtual prison, above and below ground.
Located along the Moskva River, Moscow is the capital of the Russian Federation and home to over 10 million people. But for nearly 2 centuries, from 1721 to 1917, Moscow was an overgrown village, a small part of the massive Russian Empire. That all changed in 1917, when Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown in a bloody socialist revolution. The Russian Empire became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and in 1918 moved its capital from St. Petersburg to Moscow, a blank slate for the new nation to build a modern socialist utopia. In 1922, Joseph Stalin emerged as the powerful and ruthless dictator of the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, he began to purge the Communist Party of any dissidents. Anyone who spoke out against him or his government was imprisoned, executed, or disappeared. To defend the city from his enemies, he launched a massive building campaign underground. In the Taganka neighborhood of Old Moscow is a cleverly concealed bunker, a remnant of the darkest days of the Cold War, when the US and Soviet Union were perched on the brink of nuclear disaster.
I'm about 15 minutes from the Kremlin in a typical Moscow neighborhood. You have the beautiful old churches, old homes, apartment house. You know, it's where people live. This is the location I've been sent to, top secret location. A typical building in a typical neighborhood. But I guess that was the point.
At the height of the Cold War, you could pass by this apartment building and never suspect it was actually the entrance to a top-secret military bunker. I met up with Terence Fabian. He's an American living in Moscow who spent his life studying Russian and Soviet history. He took me through the hallway of this apartment building that was an elaborate subterfuge for the massive complex below. A nerve center where the Soviets plotted their secret strategy against their arch-enemy, the US.
After you. Yeah, we can go down, take the elevator down, and it goes down 60 meters, like 200 feet.
200 feet straight down?
Yeah, it's like the height of a 20-story building.
Nearly 200 feet below this apartment complex, construction of a top-secret military bunker began under Stalin's orders in 1952.
One. All right. Here we go. Wow, look at this thing. It's so solid. Now, how many people were coming down here every day?
Okay. There were anywhere from between 1,000 to 1,500 people assigned to the bunker, and they worked in 3 24-hour rotating watches.
Okay.
So at any one time, there would have been from like 300 to 500 people actually on duty in the bunker.
For 33 years, this underground bunker served as a Soviet military communications center. Back then, it was simply known as GO-42. Hidden by an ordinary apartment building up above, GO-42 sits 196 feet underground and consists of 4 large blocks connected by a network of tunnels. Block 3 housed all the technical support systems, generators, ventilation systems, and supplies. Block 4 consisted of a canteen, bunk room, and infirmary. And Blocks 1 and 2 were the heart of the operation. They held communications offices and equipment.
Now tell me about the name of this place, GO-42. What's that mean?
Государственный объект, number 42.
All right.
Which is government installation.
Okay.
Which is a nice designation because it identifies the installation without particularly telling you anything about it.
Yeah.
Heavy security was necessary to protect the primary purpose of GO-42, communications. In a time of crisis, the leaders of this global superpower would be making world-changing decisions from these rooms.
What do we have here?
You've got shortwave radio sets, encoding and decoding machines, switchboards.
Near the end of the Cold War, GO-42 and the equipment inside were simply abandoned. But almost 50 years ago, this was command central during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, was embroiled in an escalating conflict with the United States over Cuba. As everyone braced for World War III, it seemed like Stalin's bunker might finally serve its ultimate purpose, until Khrushchev sent out an order that changed the future of the planet.
In October of 1962, this was the bunker that the message was sent from during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Really?
To withdraw the Soviet forces from Cuba, stand down, we're not going to war with the United States.
I mean, that was as close as we ever got to nuclear holocaust.
Yeah, like the pistol was cocked and the finger was on the trigger.
And they were down here with that finger on the trigger.
Absolutely.
I mean, you forget this. We're 200 feet below. People walking, going home from work into their houses. Down here, a top secret military complex. This is where the cable was sent to Cuba, calling off the missile crisis. Maybe sent through this equipment.
To ensure the absolute security of the equipment and the bunker, Stalin chose a secret organization to oversee the daily operation of GO-42.
Basically, it was the responsibility of the MGB, which was one of the forerunners of the KGB. They would have been the guards up at the top at the entrance.
Security began with checkpoints like these, but in GO-42, every element of its design was centered around preserving its secrecy.
Wow, this is steel-plated tunnel.
These are actually plates of a metal alloy. It contains a lot of lead, and the reason these are applied over the walls of the corridor was because they absorb electromagnetic radiation from all the communications gear in here.
Okay.
And that would make the bunker more difficult to detect from above ground.
What are these noises I hear around me?
It's the metro, the subway train.
Oh, so we're at the same level.
Right. In fact, they use the construction of the metro as camouflage for construction of the bunker.
Okay. Look at this. This is the end of this long corridor, the evacuation tunnel. We're 200 feet beneath the neighborhood above us. And where are we really? We're connected to the metro. Listen, right out there. Hear that? That's a train. That's the metro, the Moscow metro, right outside this door. That's pretty cool.
With the busiest metro system in the world crowding Moscow's underground, the builders of GO-42 had to design their highly sensitive bunker around nearby subway tunnels. But Stalin's ultimate plan for GO-42 was more than a top-secret communication center.
After 1945, after the advent of nuclear weapons, when it became obvious that a lot of the other bunkers, which were near surface, would not be able to survive a nuclear blast, the decision was made to move everything deep underground.
Stalin wanted this bunker to be the ideal place for his top officials to wait out a nuclear apocalypse.
The total capacity of the bunker was 3,000 people.
3,000
3,000. They could have kept 3,000 people here alive for 90 days.
3 months.
Yep. Wow.
GO-42 was completed in 1956. But just off of Block 3 is an unfinished section of tunnel where you can see the skeleton of the bunker.
All right. Let's go down into the tunnel, into Joseph Stalin's masterpiece. This gives us a perfect way of seeing the construction. Each one of these is a segment, 6-7 foot long cast iron piece that is laid in like a model, you know? They just place these in, workers bolt this thing like crazy, and then through this opening here is injected concrete. 5 feet of concrete behind this. So as they move through, they continually build this tunnel piece by piece until they end up with this massive, massive space to defend against nuclear attack. The paranoia of that nuclear age, when people had to dig tunnels like this, bunkers like this, 200 feet beneath the earth. Same thing was happening back home in the United States. People were building bomb shelters in their backyards. There, it was an everyman kind of thing. Here, it was a one-man kind of operation. Joseph Stalin.
Up next,
There's a lot of water down there.
Oh, yeah.
Stalin's own underground waterways became a refuge for his bitter enemies.
They were used as dungeons and torture chambers.
And later, the Kremlin may be hiding a top-secret subway in the shadow of the world's busiest metro system.
So this is an entrance to a bunker below this.
And nobody has been there for years and years and years.
Russia covers 11 different time zones. Once Joseph Stalin had consolidated his power in the 1930s, he began to execute his grand plans for the ideal socialist state. The Great Purge rid the state of its enemies and provided Stalin with millions of slave laborers who could begin to overhaul Moscow's infrastructure. One of the largest projects was an 80-mile canal that connected the Moskva River to the Volga River. Up to 25,000 people died constructing the canal, many of them simply buried where they fell. But that was just a drop in the bucket for Stalin's brutal and efficient plan for modernizing Moscow. He also built one of the greatest metros in the world, sprawling parks, awesome monuments, and improved nearly every aspect of its infrastructure, both above ground and below.
These giant tubes that run throughout this neighborhood are actually Soviet-era central heating. Most of the homes in Moscow still receive their heat and hot water from a central source developed under Joseph Stalin. And just as he engineered a heating system for the city, he also re-engineered the waterways. And I'm meeting with a guy who's going to take me under the streets to show me how.
I met with Terence Fabian again. Because the subterranean canals are strictly off limits to the public, he's gotten special permission from the city to enter Moscow's watery underworld.
Boots. Yeah. Put boots on, yeah.
Running 20 feet beneath the streets of Moscow are over 3,700 miles of pipes, a major part of Stalin's plan to modernize the city, but also the site of daring escapes, prisons, and torture chambers.
There's a lot of water down there.
He says that before we go down, we have to put on special safety harnesses.
Sure, of course. Okay. All right, perfect. All right. That's pretty basic, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right. Here we are, going down into Stalin's tunnels. Great. Hey, there we go. Thank you very much. You ready? Let's go. What is this water that we're in here? Where is this going?
This is runoff from the street right now. It's still out.
But heading to what?
Heading towards other connecting pipes down the way, collectors, and from here it's going to flow through the center of the city, empty into the Moscow River.
Today, Moscow sits above a network of 190 rivers, a virtual web of water. But before Stalin turned Moscow into a major metropolis, these waterways coursed above ground, causing major floods every time there was a heavy rain. In the late 1700s, Catherine the Great had a section of the Neglinaya River diverted under the city, where it flowed into a moat that once surrounded the Kremlin. After Napoleon's siege of Moscow in 1812, the rivers were so choked with debris from the war that several more were paved over. Then a series of underground drainage tunnels were built. As the city grew, Stalin expanded the sewer's drainage tunnels even farther into the massive system it is today. For years, the underworld created to save the city offered the perfect cover for Moscow's shadier citizens.
Muscovites have been using these as shelters. Some homeless people live here. Convicts on the lam would be living down here. Smugglers would use them to hide their goods.
Right.
In a lot of cases, down by the Kremlin, they were used as dungeons and torture chambers.
Right.
But when heavy rains fell, the rush of water through these tunnels flushed out everything and everyone in its path. The constant flooding was tolerable when Moscow was simply an overpopulated port city. But when it became the capital of a vast empire, things had to change quickly.
For the 200 years that St. Petersburg was the capital of Russia, Moscow had been very neglected. It was in the early 20th century, it was basically an overgrown village.
Okay.
And in 1931, their goal was to turn it into a modern capital city.
Stalin was obsessed with making Moscow the ideal socialist city as fast as possible. That hinged on controlling its water flow. So his engineers started by repairing existing drainage tunnels like this one. Then they designed a new system of tunnels that would prevent flooding once and for all. But to get them built on Stalin's timetable, they needed cheap labor, and plenty of it.
In building these tunnels, where did the labor come from?
By the 1930s, they're already beginning to use convict labor. They decided to put them to work. Why not? Modernizing the tunnels as part of the effort to modernize the capital.
There weren't nearly enough criminals to realize Stalin's vision for Moscow, so he rounded up another source of labor, enemies of the revolution. Anyone who opposed his regime or just got in his way was thrown into a prison camp system, or gulag. Millions were forced into labor until they died. Others were simply murdered.
The writer Solzhenitsyn estimates that during Stalin's rule, some 60 million people died. That's 3 times the number that perished in the Second World War.
And this is 60 million people to bring this country up to speed in as short amount of time as possible.
Exactly.
We're talking about how many years here?
10, 20?
To go from basically a third world country to a military #1 power.
Today, these sewers quietly keep the streets and neighborhoods above safe from flood and disease. But Stalin's new underground water system actually worked against him. Anyone who was hunted by Stalin's secret service for opposing the communist regime now had a network of escape routes.
When the KGB, the secret police, were coming after people, they were using these tunnels as hiding places, as escape tunnels, right?
As escape tunnels in many cases, and not just in Stalin's time, but very recently, in the early 90s, there was one account of people escaping from the White House during the October coup attempt.
The White House, the government building here in Moscow.
Okay. They were escaping through the tunnels, the heating tunnels, the ventilation tunnels, the waterways.
Stalin's master plans to modernize Moscow and save it from flooding created this vast underworld. But in the end, it became a place where his enemies could escape his iron grip. Up next, Stalin turned Moscow's metro into a massive wartime bunker and a top-secret subway that may still be used by the Kremlin.
We're not supposed to go down here, but I gotta look at this.
And later, Stalin's plans to bury Moscow's most precious religious monument beneath his colossal palace. The search is on for Ivan the Terrible's priceless library. Go to History.com for the Naked Underground web series.
Спасибо. Just like everything else in Moscow, you have to look below the surface to know what's really going on. The Moscow Metro may be the most beautiful in the world with its chandeliers, its marble tiles and mosaics, but its true purpose is to protect civilians and government in a time of crisis, even if that crisis, in today's terms, is all-out nuclear war.
Military expert Terence Fabian was going to take me through the Chisty Prudy station to see evidence of the hidden objective behind Stalin's underground masterwork.
This is beautiful.
This is Ploshchad Revoluции, Revolution Square, the station, and you have heroes of the Bolshevik Revolution, soldiers, sailors, airmen, peasants. But if you look at the whole design, you see that the architect was trying to convey a hidden message. All of these figures under the arches, hunched over like this. The architect wanted to suggest repression of the people by Stalin. He got away with it, because in Soviet times, you could suggest something like that very subtly. People would read between the lines.
Right.
And also on the surface, this is a monument to the great Soviet people.
This subtle message may have slipped by Stalin's secret police, but the creation of a modern metro system was central to Stalin's vision for modernizing Moscow. The first line, known as the Red Line, was started in 1932 and opened just 3 years later with 10 stations covering almost 5 miles. By 1938, 2 more metro lines were running 100 feet beneath the city. Today, it's the busiest metro system in the world, but the tunnels millions of locals ride through every day only conceal Stalin's unseen underworld.
How many people ride this thing every day?
On an average weekday, between 8 and 9 million people.
8 and 9 million people a day.
Right. And in the course of a year, about 3 billion people.
Billion.
Right. That's half the population of the planet.
Over 75,000 workers labored over 5 years to create one of the deepest subway systems in the world. Many were professional miners and steel workers. Others were students eager to fulfill Stalin's vision of a modern socialist state. But the ultimate purpose of the Moscow Metro was to protect its people from Hitler's bombs.
One of the reasons that they decided to build such deep stations right in the heart of the city was for them to act as bomb shelters.
I see.
Because Stalin knew that war with Hitler at some point would be inevitable. People would come down here. It was open from sundown to sunup, and people could come down and sleep here on the platforms.
The fortified underground was desperately needed. On October 2nd, 1941, the Nazis began their assault on Moscow. In the Nazis' first air raid alone, over 100 tons of high explosives and 46,000 firebombs were dropped over Moscow. The city above was devastated. But the ingenious engineering saved the metro and the people of the city. And because Moscow was able to survive the Nazi onslaught, these tunnels helped save the world from Hitler.
So this place isn't just civil transportation, it's also civil defense.
Right, exactly, to this day.
This is the blast door structure, very military looking, and all along here, this whole thing is basically part of the structure that protects people down here in the event of a bombing.
For years, Moscow's citizens knew their metro stations could double as bomb shelters. What they didn't know was what lay below their subway system. Terrence is taking me to another station for a glimpse into the top-secret underworld beneath the Moscow underground. Chisty Prudy Station sits beneath the heart of Moscow. Because it was centrally located and sits 120 feet beneath the city, it was the perfect spot for a military headquarters. During World War II, this station was closed to the metro riding public.
The air defense staff met there. Stalin almost certainly came here.
Okay, so for the entire war, World War II, what is a subway station now was a command center for the army.
Right.
So you're saying all these portals would have been blocked off with plywood.
Right, so that nobody could see in.
Okay, so you got trains going by here, the public can't come in here because this is where the military's doing their business.
Amid rush hour traffic, these cavities in the middle of Chisty Prudy Station were used by the military. Trains could move through here, but would roll right by the station, and passengers were unable to see what was going on behind the plywood walls. But beneath this hidden command center, Stalin built an even more top-secret underground bunker. To this day, a highly classified system of tunnels remains hidden beneath the city. Absolutely no one is allowed access.
So this is an entrance to a bunker below this.
And the bunker is still intact.
Really?
Right, though nobody has been there for years and years and years.
You're talking about a bunker beneath this subway station that has always existed since its construction. Which was reserved for Joseph Stalin or VIPs.
Right.
The bunker is part of a vast military installation that lies below the metro, under the entire city of Moscow. Russians refer to it simply as Metro 2.
Metro 2, supposedly, is this immense network of underground metro tunnels, military command centers, bunkers extending throughout the city and out beyond the borders of the city to command posts in the south, the northeast, the southwest.
A secret railroad underground.
A secret railroad. As in some places, an entire underground city.
And how do you know this? I mean,
there have been, the way it originally surfaced was in the newspapers in the early 1990s. You know, a neighbor of mine knows a woman, a pensioner, who worked as a cleaning lady for the KGB, and they took her to all of these places on a secret underground railroad.
Right.
And then gradually more and more details began to surface. And since knowledge of this first surfaced in the early 1990s, it's probably been Moscow's worst kept secret.
And there is evidence that the U.S. government is also in on Moscow's secret. Terrence got his hands on a recently declassified Department of Defense document that shows Metro 2's general location.
I have a map. This is from a U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency report. That's a rough schematic of the Metro 2 system.
So this is an official U.S. document?
Right.
I see. So in event of what? I mean, nuclear holocaust, the ultimate disaster, this other system exists to take care of the most important people.
Right. And they're still adding on to the system as far as we can tell. Right. Just like they're adding on to the public metro system.
Lots of secrets still underground, huh?
Absolutely.
The Kremlin still denies the existence of M2, but most Moscow locals believe that this remnant of Stalin's grand scheme is still secretly operating just beyond these walls.
We're not supposed to go down here, but I gotta look at this. Yeah, look at this. You can see this whole other world down here. You know, upstairs, the whole of Moscow is using the subway system. Little do they know, right beneath their feet is a military installation, a bunker system that even, it is suggested, goes further. 120 feet here, 300 feet down below, an entire mysterious secret railway system. Suggested, evidenced by even U.S. documents, that it exists, but we're not allowed to see it. Nobody's allowed to see it. Moscow is secret all the way down.
Up next, beneath Moscow's most sacred monument is evidence of Stalin's plan for the tallest building in the world, the Palace of the Soviets. And when Stalin faces off against his arch-rival, he hides his war room in the least likely place.
So this was really where he ran the show?
Yeah, that's his desk.
Moscow is home to the largest number of billionaires in the world.
Stalin ruled with an iron fist and planned to build his capital to inspire fear. And so he commissioned the Palace of the Soviets. It was designed to be the tallest building in the world, topped with a statue of Lenin that towered over 300 feet in the air. But before Stalin could build his masterpiece, he had to make room for it. His first step was to demolish the city's most sacred monument, effectively burying religion beneath the Iron Curtain.
One of the greatest threats to Stalin's utopian society was religion, so he made plans to crush Russia's most holy symbol with a symbol of the state, the Palace of the Soviets. To make room for Stalin's colossal palace, he knocked down the original Church of Christ the Savior. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the church was rebuilt on the same spot. But evidence of Stalin's megalomaniacal plans for his grand palace can still be found underground. Daria Belyakova, a local guide, was going to take me inside.
Daria.
Hi, Don.
Hi, nice to see
Glad
you.
to see you.
Thanks. So this is the Cathedral of
Christ the Savior.
With its golden onion domes, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior towers above the Moscow horizon.
Right.
But what you see above ground
An incredible building.
is only part of a more massive complex, much of it underground. Even the main council hall was built 45 feet below ground level.
Right now, we are in the Hall of Church Councils, where the major events of church life take place under the guidance of the Patriarch, who is the head of the Russian Orthodox Church.
The first Cathedral of Christ the Savior was commissioned in 1812 by Alexander I to celebrate Russia's victory over Napoleon. When completed in 1883, it was instantly embraced by the people as the ultimate symbol of the Russian Orthodox Church. But just 48 years after its completion, Stalin ordered the monumental cathedral that held the heart and soul of its people razed to the ground. But 45 feet beneath the cathedral is evidence of that original church and of Stalin's master plans for his grand palace. Daria introduced me to Oleg Bogdanov, an engineering expert who knows the secrets behind Russia's most sacred building.
So the original cathedral that was here, what happened to that?
Что случилось с первоначальным собором?
Храм Христа Спасителя, к сожалению...
In 1931, it was pulled down, exploded, on the direct order of Stalin.
Why did he do that?
The communists had a unique aim. In the whole course of history, there hasn't been a single case of a nation without God. And that is something the communists aimed to achieve. There was no way for communism and orthodoxy to agree. They were absolutely rivals.
In only 6 days, with 3 massive explosions of TNT, Stalin crushed the Russian Orthodox Church's most sacred symbol. Anyone who objected to this wholesale demolition was exiled or killed, including tens of thousands of priests. Construction for a new building began soon after. The Palace of the Soviets was to be the cultural center of the entire nation. Plans for it reveal a circular structure rising over 1,300 feet with a 318-foot bronze statue of Lenin perched on top, making it over 50 feet taller than the Empire State Building, a symbol of the triumph of socialism.
So he eradicated orthodoxy, basically replacing it with a religion for the state, with Lenin as its premier saint of this.
So changing the mentality, the
Right.
consciousness of Russian people, completely eradicating our religious roots.
I see.
To build a foundation powerful enough to hold up such a massive building, Stalin's engineers tore down the hill on which the cathedral had once stood. Then they dug an enormous basin, 26 feet deep, and filled it with concrete 90 feet thick. The steel framework for the first 10 stories had been erected by 1941, but construction came to a screeching halt when Stalin found out Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union. As war raged around Moscow and resources ran thin, concrete and metal were stripped from the foundations to make bunkers and defenses to protect the city. The Russian people's most precious cathedral had been destroyed in vain, and the foundation of the palace of the Soviets lay abandoned for 20 years, filled with rainwater and debris.
It was littered, and it was a kind of bog, a swamp here.
And what a tragedy to have. It was the premier church in Russia, and now it was just an ugly hole in the ground, basically.
Yes.
Quietly, Muscovites dreamed of the day when the cathedral might rise again, and it finally came in the early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet regime. With donations and volunteers streaming in from all over Russia, work on the new cathedral began in 1994, and a new foundation was built on the remnants of the basin constructed for the palace of the Soviets. To get a sense of the scope of this undertaking, we head down to the basement of the church, 45 feet below the cathedral.
Look at this space here. This is the bottom of the church above, the basement. It's also inside the superstructure they had to build to bring the ground up to where it used to be. Joseph Stalin rips down a church to create a palace of communism. Communism fails. The people ask for their church back. They demand it. And in order to do that, they have to rebuild the hill and put an exact replica of the church right on top of it. So this superstructure is that hill, and we're standing beneath an exact replica. So it's 21st century technology hidden beneath a 19th century church.
Up next, in a time of disaster, Stalin's seat of power goes 20 feet beneath this sports stadium.
So from this place here, in the middle of all this, he would speak to his elite command.
The search is on for Ivan the Terrible's priceless library. Go to History.com for the Naked Underground web series.
Throughout the 1930s, Stalin knew he would eventually have to face off with Hitler. To prepare for this deadly battle against superior German firepower, Stalin turned his capital into a fortress. Basically, everywhere he would need to be, he built a bunker directly beneath it. The Kremlin, government buildings, military headquarters, even a sports stadium, where Stalin would rally his people to stand and fight when the Nazis began their inevitable march towards Moscow.
Guarding Stalin from the Nazi war machine meant creating a direct link from the center of power, the Kremlin, to a top-secret underground bunker where he could run the war, a capital beneath the capital.
So the stadium is up above.
Exactly, this is the stadium.
Soviet historian Gennady Kuznetsov was taking me inside the cavernous bunker known as Izmailovo, which was created as Moscow's underground firewall against a potential Nazi invasion.
So this entire place, the market and everything, was part of a military installation.
Exactly.
Stalin had already built a network of bunkers under the Kremlin. But in the event that the center of government was captured, he wanted a fail-safe command post on the outskirts of the city from which he could stage a last stand. So he chose the perfect cover, a sports stadium.
It's so palatial.
Yeah,
I mean, lavish, isn't it?
Exactly, it looks like an underground palace.
This is how Stalin had it built.
Oh yes, it was designed that way.
In 1933, Stalin announced the construction of a new athletic stadium on this site. What his public didn't know was that something much bigger and more important was being built 20 feet beneath it.
When you say construction, you're not just talking about this bunker, you're talking about the stadium above, right?
Exactly, because actually both were constructed simultaneously.
And why was that?
Because stadium was constructed as a cover for construction of this bunker.
All right.
By 1939, as the first battles of World War II began to rage, the Soviets poured all their money and manpower into the war effort, so the stadium project was left unfinished.
How much space underground are we talking about?
When it was finished, the area was 1 million square feet.
1 million square
1
feet.
million square feet.
The bunker was dug up to 4 stories deep into the hillside adjacent to the stadium. There were rooms for tanks, weapons, and supplies. In the center was a main conference hall and Stalin's personal office. Each room was bomb-proof, made of prefab steel and concrete. But Izmailovo is much more than a bunker below the stadium. It's a complex system of subterranean metro links and highways, connecting the massive bunker to the Kremlin. The supplies stored here could have sustained Stalin's government for several months.
How would he get here from the Kremlin?
By a tunnel. A special tunnel was dug between this bunker and the Kremlin.
That special tunnel was built as part of the Metro 2 system, Stalin's top-secret transportation network. If the Germans ever captured central Moscow, Stalin and his generals would ride Metro 2 to this bunker and plot their next move.
So all the generals and politicians are looking at Joseph Stalin speaking from this chair.
Oh yes, from here, from this place. But he preferred not to sit, he preferred to walk.
Oh, okay.
Even in the middle, if we just walk in the middle, we can see and we can hear the acoustics.
This amazing effect, typically used in the construction of Russian churches, is achieved by positioning a series of empty clay pots in the center of the ceiling. The pots trap sound and circulate it, creating a reverberating amplification. Unlike a microphone, it couldn't be detected by electronic surveillance or knocked out during a power failure. But there was a more personal reason Stalin insisted on this feature.
He had a very soft voice, and this was designed so everybody could hear him. And of course, it added some special feeling that he was a very strong, influential, and powerful person.
So I'm speaking here, and I sound like God. So it makes you feel good, right?
Oh, yes.
Stalin would speak to his elite command from this war room 20 feet beneath the stadium. But private conversations were held in Stalin's personal office.
That's his desk. This is his desk. We can see 3 telephones, one for connection with NKVD, or KGB.
The secret
police, exactly. The second for connection with the general headquarters, the army, and the third with the connection with the government.
Deeply paranoid, Stalin was obsessed with rooting out all potential enemies within the Soviet Union, using the secret police to throw millions of people, including some of his best generals, into prison camps. Yet he was completely blind to the much more immediate danger posed by Hitler.
Because he completely ignored all the information from our intelligence officers from the West that Germans were going to attack the Soviet Union on June 22nd.
Even though Stalin had been preparing for an eventual war with Germany, he never expected it would come so soon. Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact in 1939, and Stalin truly believed it would be honored. So when word of the German attack reached him, he went into a state of shock.
He was a Georgian. He was brought on Caucasian traditions. If a man promises, he has to follow his obligations.
And for this, I mean...
it was really very difficult.
This was almost a breakdown for him.
For 5 long days, the entire nation waited for their leader to recover, while the German army streamed into Russia, crushing the unprepared Soviet troops in their path. When Stalin did finally re-emerge, he leapt into action, converting civilian factories into munitions works and rallying his people for war. By December 1941, the outlook was bleak for the Red Army. German panzer divisions were stationed just 19 miles outside Moscow, visible to Muscovites through binoculars. It seemed as if Stalin might have to spend the rest of the war in this secret bunker beneath the stadium. But as temperatures dropped and the city's defenses held, Hitler began to realize the enormous strategic blunder he had committed. During the 4-month Battle of Moscow, it is believed almost 200,000 German soldiers died, while the Soviets suffered almost 1 million casualties. The Germans were forced to retreat. It was the beginning of the end of the war. Joseph Stalin and millions of his countrymen had repelled the largest military campaign in history. The cost in human lives was unimaginable. But in the wake of the Soviet Union's darkest days, Stalin would emerge as the most powerful leader in one of the most powerful nations the world had ever seen. In 1989, the Soviet Union